Hello, everyone. We have quite a few participants. This makes me very happy. My name is Lorraine Bonner, and I'm speaking to you from Oakland, California, the land of the Ohlone people. I would like to welcome you to this discussion of white nationalism, a cancer which has been with us since the founding of our nation, and which in recent times has become unavoidably obvious to even the most fervently oblivious. The same mob that lynched thousands of innocent Black men and women and using the social media of the day sent postcards of these murders to their people who weren't able to be there. The same mob that screamed and spat at first graders as they walked to school, who swarmed and beat freedom riders and set their buses on fire, who obliterated Black Tulsa. That same mob finally turned on people whose lives really matter, and we now seize the time to be able to talk about it before the nation's short attention span shifts elsewhere. A few announcements. This event is being recorded. However, only the speakers will be seen and heard on camera. For security, since events addressing Nazism and white nationalism are targets for Zoom bombing and the use of hate speech, the chat function in Zoom is disabled, and the audience will not be able to unmute themselves. This program is a gift of Repair, a health and disability justice organization working out of Los Angeles, California. Repair acknowledges the Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of Tvangar, named by the colonialists as the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands, and are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatom, the indigenous people of this place. We pay our respects to Ho'upaktam, the ancestors, Ahirom, the elders, and Iohinhikam, all our relations, past, present, and emerging. Please forgive any defects in pronunciation. We invite everyone to learn about upcoming virtual events sponsored by Repair, including 2 programs this weekend. This Saturday at noon Pacific time, join us for the launch of the Civics Project, a weekly 60-minute virtual series that offers public education about how government works in the United States, an extremely urgent subject now and always. And on Saturday at 4 p.m. Pacific time, we'll be hosting Commitment, the 6th and final event of our 2020-2021 virtual storytelling series, featuring 5 wonderful storytellers. In addition, as a follow-up to today's event, educators or aspiring educators in any setting are invited to join us on March 3rd at 3 p.m. Pacific time for Teaching About White Nationalism, hosted by Beth Ribet and Leslie Bunnage, 2 of our speakers today, in collaboration with Mariam Noah, a wonderful anti-racist K-12 educator. Registration is live for upcoming events through Eventbrite. I'm going to move now into the program. I will be introducing our speakers, and we will then spend some time on the events of January 6th, when a mob of white nationalists attacked the Capitol building. We will then ask each of our speakers to respond to a specific question centered on their area of expertise, and then move into a more general discussion of these issues. These are our speakers. Leslie A. Bunnage, PhD, MA from UC Irvine, is an associate professor of sociology at the Seton Hall University. Her research interests include social movement mobilization and strategic formation, intersectional racial, gender, and socioeconomic barriers to participation and leadership development within social movements, and labor movement revitalization. She studies and writes about both left and right-wing social movements and completed a prior study on racialized patriotism, white identity politics, and the Tea Party in New Jersey. She has recently focused on the role of internet communication technologies in movement mobilizations and their outcomes. Shannon Foley Martinez, a former violent white supremacist, has 2 decades of experience in developing community resource platforms aimed at inoculating individuals against violence-based lifestyles and ideologies. Foley Martinez has worked in at-risk communities, teaching and developing dynamic resiliency skills. She has worked for school systems, nonprofits, and community organizations. She has participated in programs with such organizations as the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, the National Counterterrorism Center, HIDAYA, the Center for Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence, UN Women, and the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Her story has been featured globally, including The Today Show, NBC's Left Field, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Associated Press, the Washington Post, Marie Claire Magazine, Quartz, Al Jazeera America, and Georgia Public Broadcasting's On Second Thought program. She has been a commentator on such news outlets as HLN, CNN, Canada One, and BBC Radio. Foley Martinez has also assisted in training law enforcement officers, building programs for educators, and collaborating with tech companies like Google and Twitter. As the mother of 7 children, she feels passionately about building empowered families and communities. She believes that we all have the power to enact profound and fundamental change in our lives. Priscilla Ocean is a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she teaches criminal law, family law, and a seminar on race, gender, and the law. Her work explores the ways in which race, gender, and class interact to render women of color vulnerable to various forms of violence and criminalization. Her writing has appeared in academic journals such as the California Law Review and the UCLA Law Review, the George Washington Law Review, the UC Davis Law Review, and the Du Bois Review, as well as popular media outlets such as the Atlantic Magazine, Los Angeles Daily Journal, Ebony, and Al Jazeera. Ocean received the inaugural PEN America Writing for Justice Literary Fellowship and served as a 2009 to 20 Fulbright Fellow based out of Makerere, University School of Law in Kampala, Uganda, where she studied the relationship between gender-based violence and women's incarceration. Ocean has applied her work to broader advocacy efforts as she has served as a trainer for federal public defenders, assisted in the development of new programs for domestic violence centers in Los Angeles, and strategized with community groups regarding efforts to monitor conditions of confinement in Los Angeles County's Women's Jail. Ocean is also a member of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Oversight Commission. Beth Ribet is the director of Repair, a health and disability justice organization based in Los Angeles. As part of her work with Repair, she launched the Civics Project, which delivers community education about government and politics in the United States with an emphasis on racial, gender, and economic justice. She wrote her doctoral dissertation based on interviews with Jewish daughters of Holocaust survivors in the United States, and teaches a course on white nationalism and Nazism in the United States each spring at UCLA. With Leslie Bunnage, she co-authored a forthcoming publication entitled Teaching About White Nationalism. She is a survivor of violence and a person with disabilities, and speaks about the experiences of people who are disabled as a consequence of exposure to violence, exploitation, and inequity. Chris Stark of the Anishinaabe and Cherokee people is a grassroots organizer, author, and researcher. focused on violence against Native American women and youth. She has researched and written about white supremacy and misogyny, most notably in Strategies for Justice for Sex-Trafficked Native Women, and as a co-author of the Prostitution and Trafficking of Native Women in Minnesota. As a resident of Minneapolis, she has written legally blurs and similar groups' involvement in violence in her neighborhood during and after the protests of the murder of George Floyd. A very distinguished panel indeed. As we turn to the events of January 6th, I would like to open the discussion by reading a quote by Lorraine Bonner. This is the quote. The naivete that allows people who should know better to keep talking about the Capitol building as a place of freedom, the display of white supremacist muscle as an aberration, and US democracy as something we get to return to is toxic. It's a luxury indulged in at the expense of people who are never deemed innocent, for whom that muscle is a fact of daily life, who face exhausting, lifelong battles to participate in any portion of the democratic promises of a constitution never intended to include us. In the past 2 weeks, since the invasion of the US Capitol.
Lorraine, my apologies for the interruption. Folks are not hearing your sound very clearly. You're cutting out.
Oh, my goodness. I don't know why. What should I do?
Good question. Do you want to disconnect? You want to mute for a second, unmute? Go ahead and unmute.
Okay.
Oh, much better.
Is that better? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
This is the question we're asking of the panelists. In the past 2 weeks, since the invasion of the US Capitol building by Trump followers, we have witnessed media attempting to define and explicate the context, origin, and import of the MAGA mobilization. As you have encountered various responses to the events of January 6th in DC, what have you noticed about the ways recent events are being named and understood? This is a question for all of panelists.
Gotcha. And I'm inviting any of our panelists to unmute. And I don't think we've selected an ordering. Lorraine, you might want to call on somebody.
Oh, okay, we can do that. I'll call on you first, Beth.
Oh, okay then. So in brief, you know, like many, I've been taking note. I've probably been watching the news more than I think I ever have, honestly, at any point in my life. And I've been really, really fixated on the ways in which recent events have been framed. And one of the things that's really struck me is hearing folks over and over again describe the United States and say, this is not who we are. And say, this is not America, this is not how Americans behave, while also, of course, talking about the dignity and almost sacredness and centrality and importance of the US Capitol as a symbol of freedom. Lorraine was cutting out a little when she read that great quote by Aurora Levins Morales, and I'm going to read it again, and this is from a piece that she wrote last week in response to the Capitol riots titled "The US Invades Itself." And she said, the naivete that allows people who should know better to keep talking about the Capitol building as a place of freedom, the display of white supremacist muscle as an aberration, and US democracy as something we get to return to is toxic. It's a luxury indulged in at the expense of the people who are never deemed innocent, for whom that muscle is a fact of daily life, who face exhausting lifelong battles to participate in any portion of the democratic promises of a constitution never intended to include us. So what I'm seeing at the same time as there's sort of an almost sense of something being inexplicable about the Capitol riots is again, an emphasis over and over on about the fact that the United States is a democratic system and therefore this is an aberration. What I'm not hearing are statements that indicate that the insurgence of white nationalists and Nazis at the US Capitol and members of the Tea Party and QAnon and a constellation of folks who are deeply grounded in white supremacist thinking. I don't see anybody, for instance, in any mainstream media commentary saying, wow, this reflects deep-seated racial injustice in US society. I don't see anybody saying, what does this indicate about our relationships to race? I've yet to hear anybody saying, what does it mean for us, given that not 12 years ago, our mainstream media was promoting or proposing the idea that we might be a post-racial society. To see this kind of uprising in the aftermath of the Barack Obama presidency, in the aftermath of the election of Kamala Harris to the vice presidency, and in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests last year. What does this tell us about the reaction to efforts to challenge racial injustice? The other things that I noticed, and I'll just mention a couple of them because I know that we have limited time. One is the terms extremism and domestic terrorism. And I think that both of these terms can be useful in particular political moments, but they also pull us away or can pull us away from really looking at whiteness and white supremacy. And as a corollary to that, I also see a lot of discussion, implicit, sometimes very flip, not necessarily clinical, though there are some clinicians in the mix, of mental illness. The discussion of MAGA protesters are being crazy, and also a lot of fixation on Donald Trump and whether he is mentally ill and in what ways. And I want to say to begin with that I don't think that being a white nationalist is conducive to mental health. So my concern about seeing that language repeatedly is not that I'm suggesting that mental illness is not a factor in white nationalist mobilization, and not that there's not valid reasons why people close to Donald Trump or people who just have clinical expertise and are analyzing the totality of his behaviors would be speculating on the subject. But we know that this is a pattern, that one of the ways that we talk about mental disability, mental illness in the United States is to frame and explain why white people behave in ways that are considered extreme or abnormal as compared to everyday acceptable white racism. Right? They must be crazy. It couldn't be that white supremacy or racism are fundamentally flawed or powerful and drive people to behave in ways that are profoundly brutal. As a matter of course, it must be that this person is mentally ill. And so whenever there's an expression of white nationalism which becomes less palatable to the mainstream, we start to see a fixation in mental illness. And this parallels a pattern that feminists have been talking about for several decades, that every time we have like a serial killer who starts targeting women and girls, folks will either focus on, is that person mentally ill or is it his mother's fault, right? So one of the things that I think is just useful to critique is the impact of that discourse, first of all, on people who actually have mental disabilities, the vast majority of whom are not dangerous to anyone except possibly themselves. And the ways in which the continuous association between mental illness and abnormality and danger also feeds into racial practice. It's meaningful to me that, and deeply disturbing to me, that in this same week, this same time period, on January 13th, Patrick Lynn Warren was killed in Killeen, Texas, after his family called for a mental health check. And instead of receiving a mental health resource officer, was shot by the police officer who showed up. The last thing that I want to just note is a little bit about the emphasis on law enforcement and arrest and the response. And making sense of that is vexing and troubling in a few respects. One is the obvious issue, which we have seen some attention to, of law enforcement complicity. A second challenge, and I won't expand on that because I think it's actually getting some attention, though not to the degree it deserves. A second is the question of sort of the processing of people who are being arrested and dealt with by the state. Mark Claxton from the Black Law Enforcement Alliance, which is one of 4 different Black organizations within policing institutions in the United States, has come forth and announced, the attackers are being undercharged. So the things that they are being indicted for, potentially prosecuted for, are significantly less than we would expect of white counterparts, for instance, and did see directed at Black Lives Matter supporters. Some of you may have also seen in the media a discussion of Jacob Chansley, who's a QAnon supporter. He's the one in the Capitol riots who had the horned hat and has been referred to as Viking Guy. And he was arrested pretty rapidly. He doesn't think he did anything wrong, so he turned himself in immediately. And he sued successfully for access to 100% organic diet while incarcerated. And folks rightly noted that that's pretty extraordinary to see in our incarceration system. The things which people of color, the things which Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks in particular have to litigate about or try to get a chance to challenge in prison conditions are about such basic survival. And it's not that I don't support energetically the organic food movement or think that everybody should have access to healthy food, but it's still pretty extraordinary to see him rapidly get access to that kind of privilege. At the same time, though, as we're noting that the people who assaulted the Capitol are being undercharged, under prosecuted when compared to particularly Black counterparts, Black, Brown, and Indigenous counterparts. One thing I don't see being talked about at all is what does it mean to dump a bunch of white nationalists into federal prison systems? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's really significant is that white nationalists recruit, they build networks, and they operate dangerously and significantly in jails and prisons. It's where they bring, it's one of the ways that they create new members, one pathway. And they are a tremendous danger to other people who are incarcerated. They target people of color, they target LGBTQ folks and people with disabilities who are incarcerated and tend to be very violent. So there's been almost no acknowledgement of that if white nationalists are arrested into a deeply dysfunctional U.S. prison industrial complex, this shifts the problem, it doesn't solve it. What would that mean in terms of the prospects of them then being released after immersion in a deeply white, deeply traumatic and white supremacist environment in which they're likely to have a lot of contact with other white nationalists, right? What would that mean for all of us? Mm-hmm. So I had a few more things to say, but I want to hear from everyone else, and I think I've taken enough time. And I also just want to acknowledge to the audience, we're having some Zoom difficulties. Our room is supposed to admit 500, and it's locked at 100. So as I'm speaking and making sure that we're doing all the things that we need to be doing today, I am also trying to troubleshoot that. If I seem distracted, that's why, and I'm glad to, again, pass it on to the rest of the folks here. Thanks.
Thank you, Beth. Would someone else like to speak next? Or shall the moving finger find someone? Leslie, I noticed that you're not muted. Would you like to speak next?
I know I'm at risk for keeping myself unmuted. So first of all, hello. It's really good to see whoever I can on the screen right now. Thank you so much, Beth, for organizing this, because this is exactly the kind of discourse that we should be having right now. And I'm not losing sight of any of that. And thank you all for your, thank you also for your initial framing of these issues. And I'm really eager to hear what everyone else is going to have to say about this. But given my specific inroad into this, the first thing that I'm going to say that struck me from my perspective in watching this coverage and the mainstream media coverage, and likewise, I've been like Beth, I've been watching more mainstream media coverage than I normally do, than I have at any other period in my life. And one of the things that struck me initially was that there was this, that the role of the Tea Party seemed really strong and was not being acknowledged. There were a lot of Tea Party flags being waved. And for those of you who don't know, that's the yellow flag with the snake, and it says, "Don't tread on me." And I hadn't heard anyone even reference their presence. And I have since then been trying to make sense of it, because I think recognizing the lack of acknowledgement of this is part of what's going to unlock, so that is part of what reveals the way in which this is an American institution, as I think is the framing of this discussion today. So the Tea Party movement it's virtually not undifferentiated from the MAGA folks, from right-wing populism, and really, really strong undercurrents of white nationalism. And I think the fact that they haven't been recognized and acknowledged in this process by the media is, in some senses, it's purposeful, because if we as a nation recognize this, then we can't regard this as returning to our democracy. This isn't who we are. Let's revert back to who we are. When we recognize that groups like the Tea Party are so active in this storming of the Capitol, then we recognize that white supremacy, white nationalism is built into the fabric of the electorate. If you look at the Tea Party in particular, they operate in what's called an astroturfing fashion. So they look like they're a grassroots movement, but in actuality, they're funded by affluent corporate right-wing elites who will support their effort with tremendous resources in order to push their agendas. So for instance, the Koch brothers and their front group, American Prosperity, played a large role in the formation of the Tea Party movement and in their support. And they're doing this in order to work with the Capitol. I mean, it's interesting to see them struggle right now to figure out what to do, because they can't have the people that are backing the Tea Party movement and backing so many of the people that were present at the Capitol. They need the Capitol in order to push their agenda. They need the Capitol in order to get the $1 trillion, tax relief for the rich. They need the Capitol. And so the Capitol can't be destroyed. That's their mechanism. I think the other part of this, so this gets into something deeper again, that would force us, acknowledging the Tea Party's presence, acknowledging this would force us to reconcile how deeply embedded in the fabric that this is. And I think on the other hand, there's another impulse here, which is not to recognize that the Tea Party really is that serious, and that these groups, right-wing populists, are really a force to be reckoned with, and really all about these kinds of things, and do have these undercurrents of white nationalism, because in part, it's hard to take them seriously. And this is one of the things that that made studying them so challenging, is that on the surface, you have, as Beth referenced, Viking guy, right? You have people in face paint. You have people that are dressed in garb, and you go to their events even, right? And it looks like a carnival, or like a circus or a parade. They serve hot dogs, which a number of you probably thought would be the food of white nationalism, but like it has this sort of 4th of July parade vibe to it. And I think that a lot of the performative aspects of this are also part of what is sort of preventing people from understanding how serious this is. And so I think that they, in some respects, have been really powerful, founded by really powerful, funded and supported, resourced by really powerful people with very specific agendas. And, but also at the same time, not taken very seriously, not paid attention to, because people didn't think they were organized and that they'd be a force to be reckoned with, because they're so hard to take seriously. So I think that those are the things that at this part of the conversation, which sort of just struck me initially from my vantage, and I'm incredibly eager to hear what the other panelists have to say.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I had seen that flag, but I didn't realize that it was the Tea Party flag. I'm really glad to hear that. And the description of the cosplay, oh, thank you. Anyone else want to speak up, or? Oh, Priscilla, you just raised your hand. Priscilla, yes. Priscilla.
Thank you. I was having a little bit of trouble unmuting myself.
Ah.
So I have a couple of things. So the first is, so Beth talked about my initial reaction, which is, this is not us. This is not who we are. So I won't repeat what she so brilliantly said. The second frame that I have been puzzled and just bewildered by is, this question about how could this happen here? Right? How could this happen in the United States? I've had a number of colleagues and friends say, I just came back from Uganda, and so many people are saying, well, this is something that happens in places like that, like Uganda. It doesn't happen in a place like the United States. And that strikes me as, deeply ahistorical and without real clear examination of the contemporary ways in which whiteness and Americanness are mutually constitutive and have historically been mutually constitutive, right? What occurred at the Capitol is what created this place and time that we are referring to as the here in the first place, right? So we think about our founding and the way in which the 3/5 clause was embedded in our foundational constitutional documents, not 15 years later in the 1790 Nationalization Act. The Congress enacted a law that restricted citizenship in the United States to free white persons, right? So whiteness and Americanness have been suffused throughout our history. And you see these mobs and these organized white nationalist groups operating based on that same ideology and in protection of that idea of Americanness and American citizenship, which they see being challenged by demographic shifts. I could go on. I could talk about at 1823, the Supreme Court announcing a case called Johnson versus Macintosh, which essentially said that indigenous communities had no right to the land that they had lived on for centuries, right? That instead the American government, the white nationalist American government had superior claim to that land. So fundamentally, this country has been suffused with whiteness as a mechanism to exploit labor from people of African descent and to expropriate land from indigenous communities. So whiteness was central to the basic enterprise of American government and American democracy. And I could go on and on with examples, and trust me, I do. But I want to say that the second point the second frame that has really been enraging to me is this idea that the U.S. Is a beacon of democracy. And I think, Beth referenced this, that we have historically and have always had free and fair elections. I'm not I'm not in agreement, obviously, with the Donald Trumps of the world, but the idea that America is a beacon of democracy and has traditionally had free and fair elections, ignores, again, the history of Reconstruction, when white supremacists, the Ku Klux Klan, used violence as a mechanism to suppress the Black vote, attacked Black representatives of the legislature in places like Louisiana and Florida, to the point where not a single representative from the South was elected to the Congress until the late 1960s and 1970s, right? So we hear that refrain constantly, right? That this is the first ex-person, congressperson, senator since Reconstruction. Why did that occur? Because of white terrorism and white supremacy that suppressed the ability of Black folks across this country to participate as citizens in American democracy, right? It essentially rendered the 15th Amendment a dead letter, and it wasn't until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that Black folks in this country had some degree of legal protection and access to the franchise. And I could, again, the Voting Rights Act has been under consistent assault over the last 20 years, right? With regard to voting IDs, laws that have enacted voting ID laws. You have laws that restrict people with criminal convictions from voting, mass elimination of people from voting rolls, and on and on and on. So the statement that the United States has traditionally had free and fair elections such that we are a beacon of democracy normalizes wholesale racialized voter suppression that has been the norm in this country. It has been a mode of governance in this country. And again, that's what that mob of insurrectionists were trying to protect, was this idea that the franchise, the mechanism to direct and guide policy and power in this country should be given exclusively to white folks, right, as part of a white nationalist ideology. So those are the two things that really struck me, this idea that how could this happen here? And the notion that this country has had free and fair elections, given the very clear contradiction of the historical and contemporary record regarding the ability of Black folks and poor folks and disabled folks and immigrants to be able to participate in American democracy is just really striking to me.
All right, thank you. Anine, that's an Ojibwe greeting, an Anishinaabe greeting, which means that I see you're liked. And so the points that Beth and Priscilla made were the ones that really also stuck out for me in the little bit of media that I have paid attention to. I shut it off probably the day after the insurrection, and have been staying away from it. So I think what I'll just mention is, the foundation of what is now called the United States of America, like Priscilla was talking about, and this idea that, how could this happen here in this country, and all these other countries around us look to the United States because we're this wonderful, fantastic democracy. And just really the lack of awareness and the lack of discussion. If we look at the founding of the United States, obviously we see Christopher Columbus coming into what we now call, Central America. And that whole process using the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery, which also, applied to Africa as well. Where the Pope said that sanctioned a war on all non-Christians, and said that only Christian rulers were able to own land. And like Priscilla mentioned with that particular Johnson McIntyre, right, I think is the name of it. We're still seeing ramifications now in rulings that are made around Indigenous rights in the United States that harken back to that particular law. So that is still negatively impacting Indigenous communities. But we have these ideas of manifest destiny. And of course, what is central to that is Christianity. And that's something that people really don't want to talk about. We're a quote unquote Christian nation, and people do not want to look at the role of Christianity. And obviously, you know, it varies from one denomination, one place, one time to another. But I think it's really crucial for us in this reckoning to pay attention to Christianity and to pay attention to how Christianity, through the papal bulls, through these ideas of manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery, set up a situation in which millions upon millions of Indigenous people on this land that we now call the Americas were murdered, brutalized, hands cut off, raped, mutilated, tore apart by dogs, died from disease, starvation, and so on. And just the brutality of the colonization and the attempted genocide of Indigenous people on this land. I don't know how something that was founded on such brutality, also with obviously African slavery, Indigenous slavery as well, that is, in my estimation, at the core of this country. And what this country was created out of is not the only thing about this country, but I find it to be, you know, astonishing, yet also unsurprising that is not discussed. And, you know, we see that Buffalo Man, you know, at the state capitol, and that also makes me think of a book by Philip Deloria called Indians in Unexpected Places. And there's some other books as well about when the late 1800s, early 1900s, as the Indigenous population here had dwindled down to about 8% of what it originally had been. So in the minds of the white supremacists, or the, you know, white people here, the Europeans, the Indigenous people were basically defeated, and the whole idea of the vanishing, you know, the vanishing Indian going off into the distance, very sadly, with the, you know, pictures of the horse and its head down and the Indian's head down and so forth. That there was a huge movement in the United States of these white men in positions of political power that performed being an Indian. And they made up all of these ceremonies and these costumes that they thought they were basing on actual Indigenous people. And so you have this political and spiritual collusion or intersection in the minds of powerful white men in this country, and how they are now claiming ownership of the land by usurping their idea of Indigenous identity and performing it at their ceremonies, their rituals. They would get together, they would have bars, and they would go out into the woods and perform these ceremonies. It was expansive. And so I guess that to add to what Beth and Priscilla were talking about, seeing him at the Capitol, it just lined right up with all of those ideas. Good.
Thank you for that perspective, Chris. Shannon?
Thank you so much for including me in our discussion. And I'm my pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to y'all from North Georgia, the land of the Cherokee and Creek people. I have been talking with my children about the likelihood of something like we saw on January 6th happen since Donald Trump was actually running for president. I monitor a lot of really awful places online, Telegram chats and Gab discussions and things like that. And I thought the likelihood of something like this happening was very high. One of the things that struck me that day was that when President-elect Biden got airtime, that one of the first things he called for was for unity. And, you know, like it continues to frustrate me because how we want to have what we feel like is unity without doing any of the work that entails. That the 1776 report, like, part of my language, ass hattery, just was released yesterday, and it is so incredibly just full of American mythos and just blatant mistruths and lies that we cannot get to a point even now in 2021 about agreeing upon a common story. That one of the very first things that we have to do if we ever hope to have anything even remotely approaching unity is to do the hard work of agreeing upon a common story, a story which does not whitewash and make nice the story of violent colonial oppression, of an economy that was based upon the backs of enslaved people, of, you know, ongoing exploitation of indigenous and immigrant peoples and communities, that we can't even speak truth. Like, I'm coming to you from the geographical south of this country, where we talk about the war of northern aggression still in a lot of schools. So to me, these calls for unity really are just like, are really just code for, we want to go back to not having to think about the fact that there are millions and millions of people who hold the view that there are Black lives that don't matter as much as our white lives, that there are immigrants and asylum seekers who have no right to come seek what they believe to be the American dream here, that Indigenous folks do not have the right to self-governance or to their land. And I think for me, like, that was, you know, that was so profound for me. That one of the things after attack after attack after attack that happens is that we really like the expediency of overt and violent white supremacy in action, that we find it very expedient because we can scapegoat white supremacy out onto these others. We can watch, you know, the views of the Capitol and be like, wow, those are extremists, those are domestic terrorists, those are the bad, that's white supremacy out there, over there. It's terrible. And recuse ourselves from the ongoing and intensive work and labor we have to do to dismantle white supremacy within our very selves, within our families, within our communities, within our schools, within every aspect of our lives. Like, from the second that we are born into a white supremacist system, and we are indoctrinated into it, and we participate and perpetuate that as white folks in America, you know, a lot of times very unconsciously. But the calls for unity to me are part and parcel of that, that white supremacy is set up to protect and perpetuate itself. And so immediately calling for unity as there's a literal coup full of really, like, genuine fascists, genuine Nazis, genuine white supremacists, genuine, like, extremely far right stuff going on, that just seemed so damaging to me. And really, like, I think we're all owed an exhale tomorrow for a minute, but the idea that anything is going to substantively change, unless we are really, really willing to, like, put everything on the table to talk about what it entails to decolonialize and to dismantle white supremacy, nothing is going to change. Like, there might be details that change, but literally nothing is going to change unless up until the time that we're ready to actually do the work that is required of us.
Thank you, Shannon. That's a very powerful message. I really like the way you point out that making the white supremacists the crazies over there relieves the vast majority of people from really grappling with the deeper realities of white supremacism. Time is moving forward, and I think we will move to some of the individual questions. And each of you will be asked a question that basically asks of you your out of your individual area of expertise. I'm going to start with Chris. As a longtime resident of Minneapolis, can you tell us more about the local white nationalist movement and its response to the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department and to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, you know, I think that the idea that a lot of white people, especially in Minnesota, have had about Minnesota, with the idea of the Minnesota nice and we're so progressive and so forth, it has really is starting to really tumble down since the murder of George Floyd. And for those of us who are in the know, and there's a variety of us, Indigenous people, you know, African-American people, immigrants, LGBT people, and so on, you know, there's actually a history of eugenics. There's a history of a deep history in Minnesota of wanting to completely eliminate all Indigenous people by our quote unquote forefathers like Alexander Ramsey and James J. Hill, who are the big, you know, corporate barons in the state and revered. The Star and Tribune, maybe 15 years ago or so, published an article about one of the leaders of a white supremacist group, a national white supremacist group living in a very nice suburb of Minneapolis. So certainly this is nothing new to Minnesota either, not even the Minnesota nice that we know about. What happened after or during, well, after the murder of George Floyd and during the protests that occurred around that is that they immediately, that evening, I believe it was, I was actually out in the woods. They started burning down buildings, and they were targeting the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis, and they burned that down, and they burned down this whole area down by Franklin and Lake Street, which is predominantly a community of color and poor and working class area. I live a little bit farther from there in North Minneapolis, which is also predominantly people of color, and I think 62% of the people here are on some kind of public assistance. So there's a lot of crime that is happening in these two particular areas. And what happened is that the white supremacists, Boogaloo Boys, a mishmash of these different groups and organizations descended on the Lake Street area where the 3rd precinct is. And then they also descended on my neighborhood. I think it was the next night, and they targeted people of color, businesses as well. So what has happened is that the assumption or the view, I think, of, you know, many white people is, you know, these Black people are out there burning everything up again. And actually what it was white men, many of them with these organized white supremacist groups coming in from outer Minnesota. And they were the ones who were setting the vast majority of these buildings on fire, and again, targeting people of color, businesses. So that in my neighborhood, we had night after night after night where the neighbors were out on patrol because there was no police, there was no fire, there was no nothing.
Wow.
So that we were literally chasing off these men who were trying to burn up businesses. A few blocks from where I live, small mom and pop owned, African-American barber shops gone. And there's no help. There was no help as, they were watching their buildings and their whole livelihood burn up. And then what happened a few days after that is we had constant, huge, enormous fireworks, gunfire, white men riding around in pickup trucks with huge AK-47s. We had these men running around in our neighborhood and, they don't belong here. We can see they don't belong here. Leaving bricks that were tied up with rags and ropes in alleys, in people's yards. They were leaving Molotov cocktails all over the neighborhood. I chased one out of my neighborhood. And so we were under assault and we were what we had. We didn't have any fire department, we didn't have any police, we didn't have anything. And people were sleeping in their basements. People were, if they could, they were vacating. And I think that as it sort of has sorted itself out, I'm just hoping that people are starting again to read about this and understand that they need to change their ideas about what happened, what actually happened, and the kind of violence that communities of color in Minneapolis, we're the ones who paid the price. We paid the price on an ongoing basis. And then we paid the price again doubly. It was not, obviously the middle class or white neighborhoods that had Molotov cocktails and had their buildings burning down. We were again further targeted, and particularly African-American, business owners losing their whole livelihood, losing all of their money that they have worked so hard to put into this. And the arrest ratio for who set all of these different buildings on fire, which also included a post office, is like 20-to-1 white men versus a person of color who's being arrested for these fires, these arsons. And I don't know if anyone has heard about the Umbrella Man. If you haven't, you can Google it. But he showed up in all black, very nice clothes, very well dressed. He had a pink gas mask on it and a black umbrella. And this was the first act of vandalism against property right after the George Floyd murder. And he walked up to an AutoZone with a hammer and he smashed in a window and spray painted "free shit, come get it" or something like that. And he just went from window to window smashing it. And then he left. And what they discovered from someone who sent in a tip is that he is a member of Hell's Angels, also a member of the Aryan Cowboy Brotherhood. And that is a white supremacist organization that is located here in Minnesota. And he has convictions for assault and domestic violence. And his group, the Aryan Cowboy Brotherhood, had assaulted and harassed a Muslim woman in Stillwater, which is a very nice white area about 45 minutes outside of Minneapolis. So those are some of the things that we were experiencing. And, I just hope that to change the narrative around that and to help people really understand what actually happened here that maybe didn't get very much media time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, that's not something that got much media attention. And I'm sure it was something that happened in many other communities of color during that time. So, yeah. I'm going to ask Leslie, in the interest of time, I'm going to mention that it would be great if people could confine their comments to between maybe 3 to 5 minutes, which is asking a lot because there's so much that needs to be said. So I'm going to go straight next to Leslie. You are a social scientist who studies right-wing populism, specifically by researching the Tea Party. You told us some things about this already. As someone who's attended a number of Tea Party rallies and interviewed Tea Party leadership, what would you want the public to understand about the relationship between patriotism, white identity politics, and grassroots activism?
Yeah, so I did reference it before a little bit, but I think one of the things that struck me, and having attended so many rallies in northern New Jersey and NYC and meetings locally, I think that groups really vary regionally, and the degree to which they're embracing white nationalism and how overt they are, et cetera, is much more muted in the particular milieu that where I was and where other students that were participating in this research, where they were as well. So I feel like in our context in our region, that the Tea Party was particularly cloaking a lot of these tendencies. Not to say that that wasn't the trend elsewhere, and not to say that it meant that it wasn't there. And so it was a process of having to unpack all of what this means directly, because this was not how it was being expressed. So patriotism is the ideology that people are very emotionally, passionately rallying behind. Patriotism. And all of the communications and the Civil War reenactments, a lot of the discussion that they were having was about talking about themselves and whiteness as being what a patriot is, that that white people are who the patriots are, and that everybody else is posed as a problem in a variety of ways. But one of the most important things to recognize and acknowledge about them is that they're not patriots. And so this was posed, constantly reinforced all the time. Why, so, and all the indirect language we get everywhere else, right? It's not just the Tea Party that's doing this, but sort of talking indirectly about also, the people that are, really kind of being posed as the enemy, who were taking welfare checks, right? And who those people were, and the lack of entitlement and legitimacy about them. So this is how this discourse took place. This is what needed to be sort of constantly unpacked in a variety of ways. And also, so much of it was it was so indirect that it wasn't only in the dog whistle form. That wasn't the only challenge, but that sometimes they were referencing things that as insiders, that they understood it internally, and so that was harder for us to grab a hold of. But yeah, so there's that. So the issue is that these are people that, even if they're less economically marginalized than some people, it's like, I would say the average Tea Partier is lower middle class. They're still economically vulnerable, and it's sort of tapping that aspect, the vulnerability, and sort of hijacking those anxieties and providing a way for people to feel a sense of superiority through whiteness, to feel a sense of a certain kind of limited empowerment within the context and the moments of the rallies, and acting up in those ways and doing those kinds of things that they did in their meetings was a way of, and sort of aligning themselves with whiteness, white politics, and that kind of leverage superiority just seemed to be an attempt to, an ephemeral and ineffective one, by the way, but an attempt to sort of soothe and make people who were feeling a sense of lots of economic and other kinds of insecurities, and to make them feel like they were grabbing a hold of that. So I'll end there. I know the time is short. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that analysis. I can't even imagine spending that much time with people. It would make me lose my mind.
I accept your sympathy. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to Priscilla. This is the question. One of the critiques raised frequently in the past 2 weeks bears on law enforcement complicity in the attack on the Capitol, particularly in contrast with brutal policing directed against Black Lives Matter activists. You have been one of the lead people responsible for civilian oversight in the Los Angeles Sheriff Department in recent years. What can you share about law enforcement relations to white nationalism?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Lorraine. As you mentioned, I'm a member of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Civilian Oversight Commission. We're a 9-member body, and we're tasked with ensuring transparency and accountability with respect to the Sheriff's Department. It's one of the largest jailers in the world. The Sheriff's Department is one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the world, and it's one of the deadliest in terms of the number of people who are killed or murdered by members of the Sheriff's Department every year. One of the things that we've been grappling with, since I joined the commission about 3 years ago, is the existence of what folks call deputy cliques. I call them deputy gangs. They are formations of members of the Sheriff's Department that encourage brutality. They incentivize, essentially killing residents in LA County. So, for example, there's one group known as the Bandidos that have these tattoos for members who are associated with that gang. And when a member of that gang uses deadly force, kills someone, or brutalizes someone, they get inked, right? So it's an incentive to use deadly force, to use excessive force, and they're particularly racist. They use Nazi iconography, and they target Black and Latinx residents, particularly in Compton and in East LA, and they protect each other. And it's not just that it's these organizations, these sort of cliques that we know of. It's about the way in which the organization, the Sheriff's Department, protects these groups. So it's a systemic problem. White nationalism, white supremacy as a mode of policing, and as an ideology that is suffused throughout the Sheriff's Department. And the Sheriff's Department isn't alone. The FBI a few years ago, prior to the Trump administration, noted that the infiltration of law enforcement by white nationalists was a problem of national security, and yet nothing was done. And the reason why I think nothing was done is because essentially historically white nationalists and law enforcement have been the same people. Right. So to uproot white nationalism from law enforcement would be to essentially dismantle law enforcement. The foundation of law enforcement is in the policing of white identity and in the policing of white racialized spaces. So if you look to some of the early police forces in the North, in places like Massachusetts and Boston, they were established to protect capital from individuals who refuse to work or participate in the capitalist economy, especially particularly men who were essentially gender nonconforming because they were not participating in capitalist economies. In the South, we know that law enforcement evolved from slave patrols and were utilized to regulate labor, right, racialized labor in the North. Those who were seeking to get out of participating in in a system of unpaid labor, forced unpaid labor, the folks who were enslaved. So we have this regime that evolved from systems of labor exploitation in the North and South that were deeply racialized and classed and ableist. In the West, we had things like ugly laws that subjected folks with disabilities who appeared in public with criminal fines, fees, and arrest. Right. So this is the foundation of law enforcement in this country. It's informed by ableism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And it's not, and you can, read some of the records of this in some of the writings of Du Bois and others. And police participate in racial violence and in the use of racial violence as a way to shape political institutions. So this is one of the frames that really frustrated me as well, is that the idea that the police essentially abdicated their responsibility to protect American democracy and American institutions. Well, that's not necessarily the case if you understand law enforcement at its core as a means to protect white identity and white interests. And so if we understand police to function in that way, then their collusion with or their failure to engage and prevent these white nationalist mobs from overrunning the Capitol is consistent with their founding and their purpose, right? And so, the idea that we would look to law enforcement to contain white nationalism seems to be naive at best. Because it is law enforcement has been the vehicle through which white nationalism has been expressed and white power preserved. We can look at historical examples like Tulsa or Chicago, where in the face of white mobs and white violence, the police essentially ceded the ground and participated in these episodes of white violence against Black folks across the country. And we see this again with the insurrection at the Capitol on the 6th. There are numerous reports coming out every day of members of the military, police officers that were participating in the siege. And I imagine that as the days and weeks go by, we will learn more about the collaboration between white nationalists and sworn members of law enforcement from across the country. And we've heard of reports from folks here in LA County, one or two deputies that have been identified as participating in the ransacking of the Capitol. So as far as I'm concerned, law enforcement, white nationalism, and whiteness are, again, like American identity itself, mutually constitutive. And if we are committed to uprooting white supremacy and white nationalism, then we have to be committed to uprooting and abolishing policing as we know it.
Thank you so much. What an astonishing and believable and knowing, just really pretty intense summary of the relationship between white nationalism and police. I'm going to turn to Shannon. Shannon is someone who was at one time in your life a neo-Nazi and immersed in US Nazi culture, and then have spent decades mentoring and working with people who are trying to exit Nazi and other white nationalist organizations. How do you understand the beliefs, the behaviors of Trump's base, and the prospects for changing those beliefs and behaviors?
So I'm not totally sure how to answer that, because, I mean, if we're talking, thinking about Trump's base, and particularly in terms of like who we saw at the Capitol on the 6th, like it's not a monolith. We're talking about multitudinous like strains and iterations and expressions of overt fascism, of militia movements, of QAnon supporters and believers, of you know, of people that we would think more of as sort of like the classical, just sort of like political supporters of Trump. So, and I think, I don't know, I think that matters because how we deal with that and the different strains and iterations of that somewhat differ. I think, though, that as we come into a new presidency, and as you know, as we face tomorrow, that it is very important that we remember that like Trumpism didn't come from nowhere, and that the groundswelling support for Trump came from multitudinous things, but you know, from, you know, like that, if there's lots of good scholarship out there, a book like Dying of Whiteness, you know, how people's fears are exploited and utilized to get them to even vote against their own self-interests or whatever, and that there's a very large segment of the population who feels like Washington is full of people who are wealthy and out of touch with the concerns that average Americans have. And I do think that without that, we've gotten to a point where through the Trump administration, that a lot of the stuff that for, at least since maybe like the 80s was like the unspoken part, began to be said out loud again. And on the one hand, I think that we have to allow some pathways back for people, that we have to allow, like, hey, you can come back into the fold, but to still, again, like focusing on like accountability. Like, what does that mean? What are our boundaries around that? What do we allow? What behaviors and what words do we allow in order for you to come back into the fold? But I think a large part of, again, sort of the unspoken thing that we're seeing, that as there are challenges to white supremacy, and as we begin the process of dismantling white supremacy, that there will continue to be backlash that people may not identify, because I think if you talk to most sort of like average like Trump supporters, a lot of them would never self-identify as being racist. They would be like, I don't have a racist bone in my body. And yet all of the policies that they support and so much of what has happened, and that their unwavering support for the policies and practices and words of this man absolutely uphold racism, and so I think one of the things that we have to have the courage to do is just do the work, put the work into practice of dismantling white supremacy. That there's a large segment of people who feel like it's a world that they don't have the skills and tools to navigate. They don't even understand the language of a lot of it. Like, they don't understand intersectionality and all this others, like that they feel very left behind by the potential new world that comes from deconstructing colonialism and from dismantling white supremacy. And and so I think some of it is acknowledging that those fears are real and that they are felt by a very large percentage of our population. But also by not coddling that I really think like we really just need to commit to doing the work. And if that means that there is some instability and stuff for, for some periods of time, then so be it. Hopefully we can minimize some of the more, violent and vile harm that might potentially come. But I really, at this point, I kind of feel like taking half steps is just prolonging the agony that, that we just sort of are at the point where, in my opinion, it would be more holistic in a lot of ways to just rip the Band-Aid off and just deal with our past and our present and build a much better future.
Wow. Yes, I agree. I'm not entirely sure how we exactly would do that, but I certainly agree with that, that sense of what needs to be done. Turning to Beth, you wrote your doctoral dissertation based on interviews with daughters of Holocaust survivors in the United States. And in recent years, you've been teaching students at UCLA about white nationalism and Nazism in the United States. What can you share about the persistence and foundations of US Nazism?
So to answer the question, I have to start a little earlier to understand the foundation of white nationalism in the United States and how Nazism in the 1930s entered into that. A lot of folks, although it's hard to find anyone in the United States who hasn't heard of the KKK, most folks have really no sense of their emergence or how they were formed or in what context. The Ku Klux Klan dates back to 1865. They were actually formed on December 25th of 1865 by 4 veterans of the Confederate Army in Pulaski, Tennessee. And, initially, I don't think that, at least from what sense of a partial record we have, I don't think that they anticipated the idea of it becoming a national movement, though I'm sure they would have been enthusiastic or became enthusiastic about that. There's some indication that they were drunk at the time, that some of the names that they came up with, like Grand Dragon and Wizard and so forth, was partly like this almost laughing sense of something that they were toying with. And what we saw was that the KKK emerged as speaking to profound white anxieties and resentment about the disruption of structured white supremacy in the aftermath of the Civil War, even though those white supremacist frameworks were just adapting and reinventing themselves and gradually morphing into what we know of as the Jim Crow era. And so since that time period, since 1865, and I don't want to suggest that there was nothing called that there was no white nationalism before that time, because the roots of white nationalism, of course, go back into the colonial process in the United States. But white nationalist organizations, like we think of, I do mark as sort of emerging in that moment, December 25th of 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, though with definite precedents. And ultimately, what we see is that the KKK and its various counterparts, which emerged over time, have a core purpose, which is to respond and channel and use violence and racist rhetoric in the service of attempting to neutralize anything that challenges white supremacy. So, and if we look at these networks over time, what we see is this keeps happening. They'll submerge, they're always maintained by intergenerational networks. And then there's a period in which the white mainstream is feeling that white supremacy is being particularly threatened, whether it's articulated in that 19th century way or not. And then they start to see an influx of activity and membership. So they're always there, they've been there, but they recruit successfully and energetically, again, when there's a sense of disruption. So we can see that this happened. Folks have been saying, oh, there was this upsurge in white nationalist recruitment and mobilization in the Donald Trump era. Well, yes and no. There was an upsurge in recruitment and mobilization beginning in 2008 when folks realized that Barack Obama was a serious candidate for the presidency of the United States. These networks got bigger, more organized, more networked. And then what we saw is that mobilization effort emerged to the point of much more public visibility as those organizers saw Donald Trump as heralding their ascension. So answering the question specifically about Nazism, to make sense of white nationalism, one of the things that you have to get is that not just racism at large, but anti-Semitism particularly is a core aspect of white nationalism. And it's often something like, when the Charlottesville protests happened, I don't know how many people say to me they didn't understand why these folks were even talking about Jews, right? Like, where did that come from? Where was it? And I was like, well, because they're Nazis, because they're white nationalists. And they're folks, but that's not how we think about race in the United States. Jews have, and there's of course an erasure of Jews of color in this conversation, but Jews have become white folks. Why would this be the focus if they're, upset about race relations? And so we have to understand, and again, I can't do this subject justice. It takes too long and I've just got a couple minutes. But we have to understand that anti-Semitism was part of the template for white supremacy in North America, right? The origins of white supremacy drew on prior histories of brown people entering Europe as slaves or as refugees from the Middle East, and the practices and mythologies and stories that Western Europe told to explain what was wrong with people of color in that context as we think of it now, to explain what was wrong with Jews, carried over very, very powerfully in the Christian colonization, European colonization process in North America. And those roots aren't going anywhere. As long as white supremacy exists, it will be profoundly anti-Semitic. So Nazism in a nutshell emerged in the United States in 1933, and it became slightly uncomfortable, but still fairly consistent bedfellows, with that existing kind of more white Christian, Southern-based, though not exclusively white nationalist sets of frameworks which already exist. The first organization was called Friends of New Germany, and it didn't last long, but then was replaced by the German-American Bund in 1933, 1936. And then as the United States entered World War II, Nazism became a lot less popular, something which public officials were no longer so visibly friendly to, and so forth. But part of the reason that Nazism took root here very easily is because there'd been a long-standing relationship between the United States and Germany, dating easily back into the eugenics movement in the 19th century. And it's really important to note that Nazi Germany admired the United States as what they perceived as a particularly effective and powerful model of functional racial hierarchy and the suppression of racially undesirable people. And so the Third Reich borrowed various things, expressed admiration, and copied some of the practices and structures in the United States in order to construct its own ultimately genocidal regime. And so there's been a kind of continual love affair, even though there's tensions between, sort of youth neo-Nazi punk movements and kind of older Christian KKK movements. And these are movements which fight with each other a lot internally. There's still been tremendous resonance between them. There's a lot more that I'd like to say, but we are really, really running out of time. So the last note that I'll close on is just as a Jew to say that one of the things I've also taken note of is how underprepared I feel like our Jewish communities are to respond to the challenges of the moment, and how urgent I think it is that we change that. We have a lot of internal work to do, right? We have our own internal challenges because as many Jews have embraced the availability of white privilege, that also means that much of our communities have turned our back on Jews of color in a way that's been really, really damaging. And that we also have not sustained and done the work that we needed to protect and to build on the powerful Black Jewish alliances of the Civil Rights era. And so these are challenges. And as I've seen, Jewish communities rejecting in some instances the Black Lives Matter movement, and again, I wish there was time to unpack this more. I want to say that this is a moment in which we need to really interrogate deeply the ways in which the promise of white privilege has allowed us both to betray has allowed many of us to betray our own histories, our communities, and as a religious Jew, I'll say the sacred work of Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world, that there is no room for white supremacy in any schematic in which we are living out the work that we should be doing in the world. So I want to just close with that and hand it back to Lorraine.
Okay, thank you so much, Beth, for that perspective. We are actually 1 minute over out of time, and I think I would like at this time to just thank our panelists and thank our audience. Beth says that there will be an email that will make it clear how to access the recording of this panel. And
can I interrupt, Lorraine? Lorraine wrote a really amazing poem last week, and I asked if she would share it, and I think she's about to cut it because we're out of time, and if anybody needs to run, they can, but I would love for folks to hear that and have it included in the recording. So I hope that you will still share that, Lorraine.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I was gonna not do it because it is like time. This is a poem that just really came in very strongly right after the election, when it was clear that many people had voted for the soon-to-be former president. It's entitled Election Returns. Half my fellow citizens hate me, like the Terminator, naked metal hand scrabbling through flames, flinging itself at my throat, relentless. Half the people in this country want me dead, uneducated, starving, homeless, sick, motherless, childless. They have hated womb and seed for generations, merciless. Why don't they know me? I've been here 400 years, but when I move in next door, the very fine people move out, taking their tax base with them. Schools rot, cops descend. People talk about the Hutu and Tutsi, Shia and Sunni, Armenia and the Turks, Germany and the Jews. I'm talking about the half who voted, who cared enough to show how much they hate. I'm grateful the young people only read history. Living it wears you down, and they must be sharp as obsidian. They bring new art and music, new love and joy. They bring vibranium, and still the haters hate. Each drowning generation hopes the next will breach the surface, gulp air, find a boat, a floating log, a human hand, anything but the anchor and chain. Half my fellow citizens hate me, but like women who still believe men love them, some of us, even some of me, still want to believe, still want to trust. So deep a need, the way a baby, innocent, sucks anything. Thank you. Thank you. And now I will close. We're 5 minutes over. And thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, Beth, for organizing this. And thank you, Repair, for being